So I'm here with Leopoldo Lopez. He is a Venezuelan politician. He, at one point, was a candidate for president of Venezuela, but he was forced out of the country. He was put in jail for, what was it, 5 years?
7 years.
7 years altogether by the regime of Nicolas Maduro. He endured that incarceration, managed to escape Venezuela, and now is one of the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition. There was an election at the end of July that was fraudulent, not just a little fraudulent, but massively fraudulent. And unfortunately, the documentation that the opposition had was not sufficient to force the Maduro regime to step aside in favor of a democratically elected president. So maybe we could just begin, Leopoldo, if you just bring us up to date on the situation, because the repression in Venezuela has intensified as they become insecure about, the results of the election.
Oh, thank you. It's a great honor to be here, Frank. Where are we in Venezuela? Well, we are at a point where there is no doubt of what the Venezuelan people want, and that's very significant. It's not the first time that we are here, but in the proportion of the vote on the 28th of July was huge. 70% of the people, under very difficult conditions, voted in favor of Edmundo Gonzalez, in favor of democracy, in favor of change, and against Maduro. If the people that are living outside Venezuela, that Venezuela has today the largest migration crisis in the world, we're talking about 8.5, so it's 30% of the population that lives outside Venezuela. If those Venezuelans would have been able to vote, it would have been 90%. So that's an important first condition to understand where we are. It's not a polarized country. There are not two sides in the population. It's the population against the regime. It's the oppressor and the oppressed. And that has been a very significant win for the democratic movement in Venezuela. We've been going to elections under the autocratic regime of Chavez and then Maduro for many years. So the democratic movement of Venezuela has been capable of deploying the capacity to get the results in real time through the voting machines. And that's what happened in this election. And that's why we have been able to prove that these elections were won. Not hearsay, not that we think we won. No, we won because we have the results. We have the voting results of each one. The actual paper receipt of each one of the more than 30,000 machines that led the process. So everybody knows Maduro lost. The military know this because they were in charge of overseeing the process. The Venezuelan people that voted and the Maduro regime themselves know that they lost. And also the democratic international community know this. So after the landslide victory, there was an uncertainty. What would Maduro do? Maduro could have recognized the results or could have, as many envision, commit a fraud. And that's exactly what he did. And that came with a massive wave of repression. Venezuela went into this election with over 200 political prisoners. Now there are more than 2,000 political prisoners.
Wow.
So it's been a tenfold increase in terms of political prisoners and everything that means. For the first time in more than 25 years, the entire political movement is in hiding. From Maria Corina Machado, who has been leading the process.
That very charismatic figure that really organized the vote for Gonzalez.
Yes, who was a candidate and then she was disqualified to run. She's in hiding. But also tens of thousands of political activists all over Venezuela are also in hiding. So for the first time, politics in Venezuela is clandestine politics. And this is new. We hope we can overcome this, but this is a reality in which we are. So we are at a point where the case of Venezuela needs to become a priority for democratic governments. I would love to be in the position of saying that the problems of Venezuelan people will be solved by Venezuelans. That's a very sovereign way of wanting things to be that way. But unfortunately, the case of Venezuela is not only linked to Venezuela. Russia has been very active in many respects, militarily, through the kleptocratic networks, diplomatically, since the turn of the century, particularly since 2007. China has also been very active. Actually, Venezuela was one of the largest recipients of Chinese funds. Over $40 billion were given to the Venezuelan regime. Then Iran also became embedded for years and more actively after Ahmadinejad. So this is a reality that we need to face.
And of course Cuba.
And of course Cuba, of course, historically. But Cuba, it's kind of was at the beginning. It has evolved to go way beyond Cuba. Cuba, in a way, is the regime that has taught many of the things that are being implemented: social control, censorship. The diplomatic networks were tapped into by Venezuela through Cuba. But these mighty autocratic powers have a big foothold in Venezuela. So the case of Venezuela today is a case for the global confrontation between autocracy and democracy. And I believe that Venezuela needs to be understood as a great opportunity, because I have been in conversations where the case of Venezuela comes up as a problem that inevitably needs to be dealt with, but with not too much enthusiasm. What I hope is that the democratic governments understand that Venezuela can be a huge opportunity for many reasons. A huge opportunity for democracy, but also a huge opportunity for energy, oil and gas, a huge opportunity for investment, a huge opportunity for stability, a huge opportunity for the migration crisis that the United States is facing today. So that's what I hope, and particularly for the U.S. government to understand and approach Venezuela with all of the different possibilities of tackling the case of Venezuela as an opportunity.
Let's talk about that migration issue, because those more than 8 million that have left, a lot of them have ended up in the United States. So it seems to me the United States has a strong interest in having a democratic government in Venezuela so that people can go back.
Well, it's interesting the way that you frame it, because that's exactly the way it should be understood. That in the end, as James Carville said, during the Clinton election, it's the economy stupid. In the case of Venezuela, for migration, it's democracy stupid. It's democracy. So Venezuelans inside Venezuela and outside have been asked about their opinion, whether they would go back or decide not to leave Venezuela. And very interestingly, when they are asked, would you go back to Venezuela if there is economic stability? Around 25% of the people answered that they would go back. The following question is, would you go back to Venezuela if there is a transition to democracy? Around 60% of the people say that they would go back. And in the case of the Venezuelans living in Venezuela, when they are asked, would you be thinking of leaving Venezuela if there is no political change, more than half of the people would be thinking the possibility of leaving. And if there is a transition to democracy, that number is below 15%. So the point being that the best policy to contain migration from Venezuela is democracy. And hands down, and I think that this is something that it's proven by opinion polls and by facts, that even with a mild economic stability that Venezuela went through over the past years because of the licenses for oil that were given to the Maduro regime, migration only increased. So I think that understanding the migration challenge through democracy, it's a great opportunity.
So let's just be clear about this. Learning to live with the Maduro regime is not a solution to anything, because there's been a temptation to say, well, he's been in power, we don't see how he's going to get out of power, be forced out, so let's just make the best of it, and maybe things will get a little bit better if we ease up on sanctions and this sort of thing. But you don't believe that?
No, I don't believe that, and I think that was the approach towards Venezuela for the past 4 years, and it's been proven wrong. You can see that the migration increased tenfold. You can see that Maduro even got a tighter grip to power. So it's not true that Venezuela is a case, Venezuela with Maduro, a case that it can be dealt with and at the same time address the strategic interests of the United States in this case.
Yeah.
If the strategic interests of the United States are migration, law enforcement, and energy stability, well, those three issues can only be dealt effectively through a transition to democracy. And that's what we hope. We hope that democracy becomes a priority, and understanding that that priority is also the best way to address the underlying issues that are strategic for the U.S.
And democracy in Venezuela may also mean democracy for Nicaragua, Cuba, other places in Latin America.
I have no doubt that if Venezuela transitions to democracy would be the equivalent in the Americas to the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think that that will have a huge impact in Cuba, and it will have a huge impact in Nicaragua. And also, I think even beyond. Since I've been in exile, I've helped to organize and lead a movement called the World Liberty Congress, which is an alliance of democracy defenders and freedom fighters from autocratic countries. And it's really interesting to see the level of attention that the case of Venezuela has beyond the continent, in Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe. People are looking to what can happen in Venezuela as a way of seeing what could happen in their own countries. So I think, again, Venezuela is also an opportunity for global democracy. And I have no doubt that it can be a huge source of inspiration, of lessons learned, the good and the bad, because lessons are not always the positive things, but also the mistakes that we have made, to share and to hope that we can impact positively the transition to democracy in other countries.
Well, let's hope. So Leopoldo Lopez, thanks very much for talking with me. I think all of us here at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law are with you, and we wish you and the opposition, the Venezuelan democratic opposition, every success. So let's hope for the best in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thanks to your audience.
Okay, good.